everyone, it's Chris here, and I thought I'd share with you the trading bot that I've set up using TradingView and International Brokers or IBKR trading platform. So here I've got the IBKR trading platform from Interactive Brokers, and then over here I've got my TradingView desktop app running. Now, I'm going to talk through the steps and explain what I did and how I got this to work. And the purpose of this is to use strategies and set up alerts to automatically execute trades using a .NET API and VB.NET and some C# coding. Now, off the bat, I'll just apologize in advance. My coding might be a bit sloppy on this one. I didn't have time yet to clean up the code and to make everything neat and tidy, but it'll give you a good starting point on how to achieve this. It took me quite a while to figure it out, and I struggled quite a bit, so I thought I'd share this. Hopefully it's useful to you. Right, so we'll start with the principles and how this works. So what I've done is I've set up several alerts in TradingView based on a strategy. Now, don't worry too much about the strategies. You can use whatever strategy you like and that works for you, or whatever alerts is valid for you. But in my case, I've got about 10 odd strategies that's currently running. So here's an example of one. This is American Airlines. Over here on the strategy tester, I can see that I've got a 93% net profit, 90% profitable, and 21 trades. Now, in my particular strategy, I'm testing only the past 6 months. So I've set that up in my parameters here. Now, once I've set these up for each of my identified tickers that I want to follow, I can start setting up my notifications. And the way I've done this is, if we just look at the code here on the alerts, is that it's going to send me an email to my Gmail account, or my connected account here in this case, which is a Gmail account, and it's going to send me some information. So what I've done here is I said I want to see the first static text that says my FIB plus RSI strategy order. It's going to give me the order action, whether it's buy or sell, the ticker, the position size, the strategy order ID, the exchange, and the closing value. Right. So that means whenever any of these strategies are triggered, and here is an example on Microsoft. So you can see that there's a short strategy that was triggered just an hour or two ago. That'll get sent to my Gmail account. And what I want to do is I want to extract that information from my Gmail account, and I want to be able to interpret that information and then execute an order using the IBKR ABI. So here you can see this is the email that I received from TradingView. Important in my particular example is the subject, so it says alert, and then FIB-Microsoft. And here is the text or the information of the actual trade. So that's in the body of the email. So this is pretty much the information that I want to extract and that I want to then process and execute a trading order. Now, the first thing that you need to know is working with the Gmail API. So to achieve that, I've used a tutorial and the samples from this link also pasted in the comments, and this tells you how to use a Gmail API with .NET and C#. There's a source code link, so you can download that and you can use that. Now, I had to modify this quite a bit to suit my particular requirement. The first thing is you need to go to app config, and you need to change the host address. You need to change the path to the client info, the credentials info, and the Gmail attach folder. We're not going to use attachments in our particular case, so it's really irrelevant, but I haven't actually tested it and see if it works if I don't update these paths correctly. Anyway, so once that's done, you can go into the program.cs file. And again, you know, I'm not claiming to be the most knowledgeable coder in the world. I know my way around C# and VB.NET, so just bear with me. There might be a lot of redundancy in here, but it works currently, and that's important to me. All right, so what I have changed from the original code is I removed quite a lot of lines. So what I did here is I don't need the console app, this is a console app by the way, to write all this information for me. All I actually want is I want to find emails that are unread, and I want them to be filtered based on the address and the subject line. So whenever I receive an email that contains @tradingview.com, that's the first criteria. And secondly, it needs to contain the following text: alert, colon, space, FIB in my particular case. Ignore the console write line stuff. That's just redundant, I guess. But then I process the mail body, and what I essentially do is I export this to a static path. Again, a little bit of sloppy coding, but you can adjust this to suit. So what I do is I write this out to a text file. Now, what you get when this gets written out is a lot of HTML jargon, so you still need to process this quite heavily. But anyway, this is the crux of the workflow, is to write this all out to a text file. Now, in my other part of the trading bot is, and this is in VB.net, is the actual processor. So what I've done is I've just created a basic form here. I've got a couple of buttons here. The first one, here is my account ID, and this is the one that I get from IBKR, right? So that's my ID there at the top, and I place this in here. Now I'm using paper trading, or not real money, so this is a paper trading account because I'm still testing. But you can actually start to see that there are trades running at the moment based on the trading bot. Now, if we go back to the .NET app, the VB.NET app, I've got a couple of buttons here. So there's a button to start the process, and what this is essentially going to do is it's going to run in the background, and I'll show you what it looks like. It's going to run in the background, and it's going to, at set intervals, it is going to do a check for new emails on my Gmail account that match the criteria that I've explained earlier. And it's going to mark those emails as read. It's going to process the information. It's going to convert that HTML text, and it's going to extract the text information from it. And then I'm going to use that as a string array and extract the values that I want so that I can actually execute an order. And that could be either creating a new long or short order. It could be to close an existing order or to exit that order, depending on the criteria. Now, what I'm recording here is the open date, of course, when it's executed, the ticker, the direction, the quantity, my strategy, which is the ID that I've set up here in TradingView. So when it's a short fib in my particular example, or long fib, or closing an entry, or whatever the case might be. That will be different in your particular case based on your strategies, of course. And then also it's got a closed date. So what happens is when I execute an order, so in this particular case, it's opening an order. So I start with a short sell here, 56 of them. And initially that status will be open until it's closed. But you can see down here, there is an INTC again, and this one is to buy back the 56 shares. So what this app does is it actually checks to see if it's an open trade, or if it's a new trade, or if it's an open trade that is closing. In this particular case, it's telling me it's closed the trade with the ID 211, and we can see there's 211, and then it adds a closed date into this column, and it changes the open status to closed. Later on, last night really, I added a cost and an exchange fields here as well, and I'll explain that a bit later, but that won't show up yet because I've just recently added that, so all my new trades will have that information. But anyway, it's the principle that matters. By the way, the spreadsheet component you see here is called Spreadsheet Gear. It costs money, it's not free, but it's a really good component, so I'm using that for all of my sort of database logging stuff and where I want to save information. But you can use any component, it doesn't really matter. So yeah, so the way this works is I set a start time because I'm in a different time zone, and by the time that the US stock market opens, I'm usually asleep. And I want to set a timer, so I want to say let's start this in however many minutes. For example, if I say let's start this in 30 minutes from now, it's going to tell me here when the start time is going to be, and then I've got an interval of how many minutes I want to check. Now, my trading strategy, oops, there's bugs. My trading strategy that I've set up has got is in a 1 hour time frame. So what I've done is I've set my default to 30 minutes, and I usually start checking like 1 or 2 minutes after 9:30 a.m., which is when the stock market opens. So of course in New York time. But anyway, I check every 30 minutes because maybe there's a delay in emails getting sent through or for whatever reason. So far in my testing, it's real time and it works really well, and it's pretty much on the minute. But I just want to be safe and make sure I don't miss any trades or any opens or closes. Now let's go from the top down through the code. Now again, just copying and pasting or using my code is not going to work for you. You'll need to adjust this to suit, but I'm going to explain the principles. Now, the most important part and the most difficult part is connecting to the IBKR API and getting that to work. So we'll go through the logic a little bit later, but let me first explain the IBKR connection. So once you've installed the desktop workstation for IBKR and you've installed the API, then you need to start adding references. So if we look at the Solution Explorer here, you'll notice that I've got the TWS lib here, which is the IBKR API DLL that you need to reference in order to access the API. Before you start doing anything, there's a couple of settings that you need to set up in IBKR as well. So if you go here to the top of the platform and you click on Global Settings and you head down to API, then there are a couple of important settings here. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can just see what I've got selected on my screen, and that's what works for me. Most important here is that that we need to allow the following APIs or IPs, following IP. So 127.0.0.1, because that is the local host, and that's what we need to be communicating with. The other important one is to make a note of the socket port. Mine defaulted to 7497. I'm not sure whether that's going to be the same on all devices, but that's the socket port that I'm using, and I need to keep a note of that as well. There's a couple of other things. I opted to create an API message log file. I haven't been able to successfully trap error messages yet. It's quite challenging for me, but in future I intend to do so. There's a couple of settings here. You can see what I've got selected. Once you've done that, hit apply, hit OK, and I would recommend to restart the application in order for things to work. And when you restart, it's going to come up with a dialog box saying that you've got API running and blah, blah, blah. So that's what I've done. There's another thing that I forgot to mention. If we go back to the global settings, if we look at the API again and we go to precautions, if you wanted to select any of these bypass functions, you could. Alternatively, when the first order gets sent through via the API, a dialog will display, and you can choose not to show that dialog each and every time, because I'll be sleeping when this is running and I don't want a whole bunch of dialogues popping up and stopping orders from being executed. Now, just to show you, if I go here to my window and I look at my trade history, if we look at a summary, you'll see here that there are a whole bunch of trades that were executed, opened, and closed. So there is a whole bunch of trades. You can see sold, sold, sold. So I went short, then I bought them back, and then I sold one again. And if we look at the summary, we can see there's the one for Intel. It was shorted and then it was bought back. So the balance at the moment is 0. Same for Microsoft currently. I initially shorted 6, bought back 6, and then I shorted 6 again. So that's showing up. It's working correctly. The direction of the sales, the opening and the closing of the trades are executing the way that I expected them to. So that is good. Now, once you've set up your parameters and your settings in the IBKR platform, you need to set up the connection in .NET. Now, again, I'm using VB.NET, but the same will apply in C#. So the first thing is I declare this variable as the IBKR connection, and then we set up the connection parameters. And I've done this here at the bottom because it's in a separate class. So that's a new class, and we create a new instance of this class, right? And what we've got here is these 3 variables declared. So we've got IB client, and this is defined as eClient socket. We've got a signal, and we've got the wrapper. Here is the function to connect to international brokers, and these are the settings that I've used. In here at the ibclient.econnect, we can see that local host parameter, and then we can also see the client, the port, which is the 7497 that I mentioned earlier. And for the client ID, I just used 0. I'm guessing I should actually pass the client ID through to that, coming to think of it. But anyway, that's something I need to do later. Okay, anyway, so this is what I've set up for the connection. It's also recommended to disconnect to clean up things when you exit your application. So I've got a function to do that, and that's just the ibclient.edisconnect, which I'll explain where I call that later. Then there's another function to actually submit the order. This one takes a couple of parameters. There is an ID, so you need to have a integer value for that. That is always a higher value than the previous order that was placed. You need to specify the contract, which is a class on its own, and the order, which I'll get to. And this is the settings or the method that I use to place the order. And then I just put a 500 millisecond timeout, because if you execute multiple orders, if I receive multiple notifications simultaneously, I don't want them to execute all simultaneously. I want there to be a little pause between them, and that's why I put that there. Okay, so that's the connection part. Now let's look at the logic. And again, this is my particular case. Yours will be different, of course. Okay, so I try to keep a record and manage my IDs. I use multiple devices, so I use Dropbox to synchronize this. So what I'm trying to do is I'm writing out whenever I close the application, the last ID that I've used in the app. And whenever I start the application, it reads the text file and it retrieves that last ID that was used. So you'll see my next ID here is 248. These integer values need to be always higher than the previous one, but they don't necessarily have to be in a chronological or sequential order. So there can be gaps between the numbers, like you see here. I've got 212 and then 217, then 219, 220, 230. Again, not the smartest ID management system that I've set up. I'm not sure why I'm getting this error. We'll figure that out soon. But it works in my particular case, so I'm quite happy with it at this stage of my testing. Now, if we go down a little bit, so when my form loads, it kind of determines what the next ID should be. It also opens my spreadsheet that I use in Spreadsheet Gear, which is a record of all my trades. I've got a couple of routines here just to make sure again that the ID is always higher than the previous one. So it reads the text file, but it also checks within the spreadsheet with those recorded IDs that I'm not using something that is not higher than the previous one, because that will create an issue. All right, then when I hit the start button to start checking, there's a couple of things that happen. In my particular case, I've got a couple of timers set up because I don't necessarily want to start checking immediately. Maybe I want to delay the start closer to the actual open time of the trading in New York. And then I've got my interval set up. So there's a couple of routines here that manages that. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, but you can kind of see what happens. It's just some logical workflows in terms of the timing and when it should actually start. The important part is running the actual mail checker. So there's two routines that I use, and I've put them again on timers. So I've got one to run the mail check, and I've got another timer to actually read and process the data and place the order. The one timer triggers the other timer, pretty much. So here's the routine. We've got the run mailer check, and what this does is it's going to open up that console application. So once you've built your C# Gmail application, the one that I've explained earlier, this one, once you've compiled this, then you're going to end up with Gmail API.exe or whatever, and I want to execute that as a process. I also want to wait for this process to exit, so let it finish and do its job, and only then do I want to start reading the text files that were produced as a result and interpret them. So again, this runs, it waits for the process to exit. I give it another second just to wait for everything to clear up nicely, and then I start the next timer, which is the reading data. Now, I've placed a text box here on my form, and what this text box does is it's just going to give me a snapshot of the text that get extracted from that HTML jargon. And here is the process. So the read data timer gets initialized, and when that starts, I stop the timer so it doesn't continue running, and only process the information that I want once. So here I've got a for loop, and it just pretty much gets all the text files that was written out by my C# application. Remember here at the bottom that I was writing out all of this text and placing that in a folder. So pretty much I'm interpreting the files in that folder, and then I'm using a NUget package, and I'm going to show you, if we go to NUget packages here, called NUglify. So of course I've got the Google APIs connected here as well, but it's not necessary. It's only necessary in the console app. The one that's important in the desktop app is NUglify. Right, so this is what I'm using, and it's a pretty cool Pretty cool tool. You can use this to extract or convert HTML to text. So all I do is I use the NUglify tool, HTML to text, and I specify that I want to read all the text contents that was written out to these original text files. Once I've done that, I've got a string that looks pretty much like this over here. So initially in my commented out text here, I've got the setup of the strategy components, and then I've got an example of what that looks like when we extract the text from the HTML. So you see your Microsoft alert was triggered, and then I've got these vertical bars here as my separators that I'm going to use to split the text. So because all of this is always going to be in the same location in the array, it's quite easy for me then to extract the information. So I declare an array, and it's pretty much the text that is extracted from the HTML that I split with this character. Right, and here is where the stuff starts. So in my particular case, I've got specific IDs that is associated with the components that get triggered. So if we look at the list of trades here, you'll see I've got exit short, I've got entry short, we've got exit long, entry long, and in some cases where I hit a stop loss, it will force a close. So in this case, it'll say close, entry, order long fib or short fib, depending. So all I need to do is to determine what is the status and what is the current direction that we should choose. So in my case, the fifth element in the array, or actually the sixth element, because we start from 0, would be the one telling me what direction we're going. So first I want to check, are we closing a short entry or a long entry? And if so, is it the short one or the long one? Because this is going to tell me, do I need to close an existing long entry or a short entry? So there's a couple of routines here. I start recording data in my spreadsheet, and then I execute my IBKR strategy or routine, albeit. So my parameters here is I want to pass the ticker to this function. I want to pass the action as a buying or selling. I want to send the quantity and then the exchange. Now we're going to look at this function in a second. But this is the first part. So this is when I want to close an existing short strategy. So here I execute a buy order to close the short fib entry. On the next one, if it's a long fib, then exactly the same, but in this case we execute a sell order to close the long one, and we're not buying, we're closing a long strategy, so that's going to be a sell, right? Then if it's not an exit, so if it's not a close entry execution, then it means we're either going long or we're going short, and it might be creating a new long entry, or it could be closing a long entry, or it could be creating a new short entry or closing a short entry. Again, following pretty much the same logic, we just parse the information and then we decide what to do. All right, and that's the end of it. So I do the same for long. So this one is looking whether we need to execute a new buy order for a long entry or execute a sell order to close a long entry, and the same applies, for my short entries. Now, if we look at this function, execute IBKR, we can see that here it is. So these are the parameters passed to it that I mentioned earlier, and pretty much this is how it's set up. So first we create a new contract object, and here we specify the symbol, the section type. In my particular case, it's always going to be stock, so it's static for me. The exchange is smart. So using these parameters, you should be able to set up without having to go into the primary exchanges. But I've noticed on some stocks, it seems like it gets confused with the IBKR API, and it simply doesn't execute those orders. So when there's a problem, it simply just doesn't execute the order, and you're unaware of that happening. So what I did, first of all, is I said, okay, I'm either going to be trading with NASDAQ or the NYSE in my particular case. That's the only exchanges that I'm going to use. So for me, it was simple. I said that if it's NASDAQ, then it needs to change the contract primary exchange to Island. By the way, this is what IBKR defines as NASDAQ. I don't know why, but it's just the way it is. Or if it's not NASDAQ, then it's NYSE, which is then the primary exchange as defined by IBKR. There's a description that I add, and then there's a currency, which is US dollar. So that's setting up the contract. The next thing I need to do is to set up the order. So in this case, I want to know the action, which is either buy or sell. The order type, which is always for me going to be market. You can set limit orders or whatnot, but in my particular case, since I'm using a strategy and I'm connecting the strategy to alerts, it's always going to be a market order at the minute of the value of that stock. There's the total quantity, and then there's the account. Now the account again is a value, text value that I've entered there, and it's the one that I got from the IBKR interface, which is here at the top right, based on your account. So once I've got this information set up, I then execute that function, which is the submit order, right? And that's the one that we see down here. So when I scroll down and we go to submit order, that is what gets executed. Of course, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that happens. I need to save my current spreadsheet. I play a little audio of a cash register just so that it notifies me when this happened. I also put in a sleep here of 3 seconds because again, it's just extra security. Maybe it's not all that necessary, but I like for there to be a little bit of a pause between these actions. Now that's pretty much how it's set up, and it's been working fairly well. You'll see if I run the app, it's actually recorded a couple of trades, the ones that I showed you on the platform earlier, and it seems to be working. So when it opens, it plays the cash register sound in my case, but then every time it executes an order here, I'll hear the same noise. And that's pretty much how it works. So I hope that helps a little bit. I'm getting a problem here when I close the app because I'm disconnecting without having connected, which is my problem. So what I would probably need to do here is to say that if IB is not nothing, then disconnect, otherwise don't disconnect. So as you can see, still a couple of small minor bugs and cleaning up for me to do, but essentially this is a strategy and a workflow that works for me. And you can of course take this and work that further and customize it to suit your particular needs, but I hope that gets you started. And it took me quite a long time to get to this point, so hopefully this provides a shortcut for others. Anyway, that's it. I'll post the source code in the comments, and feel free to use that. Remember just to change the parameters as necessary, and happy trading. All right, cheers.